Okay, I think we can start, and welcome everyone. I suppose we are live now, both on Zoom and YouTube. And today we are going to talk about the ocean. And to do so, we need to take things in the right perspective, which for the ocean is a global perspective. There are many things to notice by looking at planet Earth from space. The most obvious is that it is a blue planet. More than 70% of its surface is covered by the ocean, but more importantly, I think 99% of the biosphere is underwater. The ocean is a true life support system for planet Earth, and it has been so for billions of years in a dynamic equilibrium between all its components, including the human species and the development of our complex societies. A development that has been promoted also by the substantially stable conditions over the last 10,000 years. But although its vastness and this rather robust equilibrium, in the last 100 years, intense human pressure have started to change those conditions, with emerging challenges such as rising temperature, deoxygenation, acidification, the unsustainable exploitation of ocean resources. Then what it was a rather stable equilibrium is now getting pushed towards uncharted territories, possibly towards a new equilibrium, with the risk that we will have rapid transitions towards unknown states. This has to be combined also with increasing opportunities and interest related to the ocean. We know that there is a growing ocean economy. So it is very essential now to define the sustainable boundaries within which our society can develop in the future. This is basically, in a nutshell, what Mission Atlantic is about, and this is also what your Friday afternoon will be about today. So Mission Atlantic is a European funded project, which is focused on mapping and assessing present and future status of Atlantic marine ecosystems and the climate change and exploitation. As I said, it is a European funded project which will run from 2020 to 2025. It will provide an assessment of the Atlantic Ocean using the so-called integrated ecosystem assessment approach, where an initial scoping phase will be followed by a definition and analysis of ecosystem indicators, and also an assessment of risks and vulnerabilities for the present state and also for future scenarios. This approach is conducted in 7 case study regions, but using a comparative approach, we will identify basin scale processes that are acting at the entire Atlantic Ocean scale. It will result in the definition of socio-ecological networks, which will be based on available data and also the new knowledge generated in the project to assess the risks of those ecosystem components to go through rapid changes. The scientific presentation we will have today will cover some of these elements in the project. But the project is also more than that. It will include the exploration of the sea with dedicated research expedition and field work from Ship of Opportunity. It will develop and test new technologies. I think Roland will talk about it a bit. Also including the use of gliders for large-scale acoustic surveys, for example, from the Azores to the South Brazilian shelf. It will include new data and knowledge to evaluate the direct and indirect effects of human activities on ecosystem components, and it will provide the tools to build a capacity around integrated ecosystem assessment with dedicated master and mobility programs, and also the integration of science diplomacy to build a new narrative of the Atlantic Ocean and to sustain a long-lasting partnership on ecosystem assessment across the Atlantic. So this short introduction is now followed by a quite dense program with 4 excellent speakers. Saskia Otto from the University of Hamburg, which will talk about statistical methods for ecosystem assessment. Roland Proud from the University of St Andrews in Scotland, which will introduce us to the biogeography of the Atlantic Ocean with different methods and tools. Sergio Floeter from the University Federal of Santa Catarina in the beautiful Florianopolis, which will talk about biodiversity and connectivity in a small Atlantic island. And then David Reid from the Marine Institute in Ireland, which will tell us how all these things are connected within the integrated ecosystem approach. And then I will ask you to put your questions in the question and answer panel of this Zoom session. I will collect all of them together with the support of the people from the Earth Center, and we will open a roundtable discussion at the end. We plan to close it at 3 sharp. So that's all from my side, and I think stop sharing and we'll invite Saskia to share her screen and the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Patrizio. Let me see. No, I have to get rid of this here.
It works fine from here.
Yeah, I don't know how to get this bar away here. Okay.
We don't see anything. We just
okay, you don't see that part. Okay. All right. So welcome everyone to the first talk of our series of presentations, and bear with me now. The first one will be a bit more methodological, but I'm trying to explain it enough applied for you. Oops, hold on. So before I start talking about statistical methods that are meant for ecological status assessments that then later on feed into risk assessment, I first want to explain quickly what we consider a risk assessment. A risk assessment is very useful if one wants to know what the impact can be of a stressor or a hazard on an environmental component. And it can help also to prioritize their management interventions and assess trade-offs. The US Ecological Protection Agency has kind of formulated a flow chart of how it can be applied. It's a bit more general. So one starts with a problem formulation and then comes the analysis, which is always a twofold analysis. First, one looks into the pressure and the exposure of it, the temporal and spatial extent, the magnitude of the change of that stressor, for example. And then afterwards, one looks at the sensitivity of the component that one is interested in and how strong or severe the impact can be. After that analysis, one tries to characterize the risk, and for that, one typically needs to know something about the current status of the component or indicator that represents the component. Ecosystem or ecological risk assessment have become pretty popular in the last 20 years. Here you see also from literature review that since 2000 it has increased exponentially. But before there were hardly any publications in the marine scientific arena. But in general, since the 90s, one can say that there has become popular to look at and also do publications on that. The risk assessment can be divided into 3 types of levels, depending on the data that goes into. So if there's no data that feeds into the risk assessment, it's considered a qualitative assessment, which is more based on expert opinion. Then if it's combined with data, then it's considered a semi-quantitative risk assessment. The typical applications are climate vulnerability assessments that have also become increasingly popular. And then the last step is a fully quantitative risk assessment that is usually conducted for scenario analysis to look for trajectories and predictions based on specific management measures. And sometimes it's very difficult to distinguish between a fully quantitative risk assessment and a management strategy evaluations. The models are often the same, and so they can be used synonymously, but it depends also on the temporal extent. Risk assessment typically look rather into the next it's our more midterm, looking into the next few years. Management strategy evaluations sometimes look into longer futures. And so a qualitative approach is often nice or suitable to identify first the pathways. In a food web, for example. The second one, the semi-quantitative, is useful then to prioritize management measures. And the third one is useful for predictions. But one can also distinguish risk assessments by the type or the level of complexity. Very simple risk assessments only look at one single stressor or hazard and one in subject, or let's say in individual species. And so those risk assessments are easier to conduct. Then there are those mid-complex assessments that either look at a single pressure or stressor and then at the entire food web, or to account for indirect interactions, or the other way around, looking at multiple pressures but a single subject or single species. And then are the very complex approaches that are hardly conducted because it's too difficult to do, or at least on a semi-quantitative and qualitative way, is considering multiple pressures and the entire food web, for example. I noticed, like, when doing this based on expert opinion, experts do not like to evaluate too much indirect interaction. It's very difficult to quantify that in some way. And so this is mostly done within a fully quantitative risk assessment framework. So in terms of the vulnerability assessments that have become very popular, which are more semi-quantitative, that means based on literature reviews, a little bit of data, one does some a scoring for the exposure of the stressor, and then also some scoring for the sensitivity of the individual species or indicator that one looks at as a response to the level of exposure. And so there are different sources that go into the scores for both. Mostly in the exposure comes more the data part, which is like climate scenarios, for example. And vulnerability is then considered as the product of both exposure and sensitivity scores. And so ideally one wants a low exposure and a low sensitivity. And if an object or species shows a high sensitivity and the exposure risk is also very high, then management measures have to be more important maybe for those species. Recent approaches also try to include the adaptive capacity into the assessment, and that it kind of modify the sensitivity score. Some species might be sensitive, but then are more easier or able to adjust to the changes. Particularly short-living species might be better in coping and adapting towards that change. And so that can be also then included in the vulnerability score eventually. And so from the vulnerability, knowing then the status, one can also then quantify the risk that a state ecosystem component or an indicator is likely to be in a bad state or unhealthy state. In Mission Atlantic, what we aim for is we would like to do a vulnerability-based assessment first, and starting with a qualitative approach and then feeding it in with data as well, as to make it semi-quantitative, and then also to apply afterwards Bayesian belief networks that can be both. They can be done semi-quantitatively or fully quantitatively. So that depends a bit on the different case studies, how much data we have. In addition to the ODEM approach, which is an approach that is done throughout the entire project in all the different work packages, and you will hear, I guess, something about it later on. So what information do we need then to do or conduct those risk assessments? So what we need is we need to know the status of each individually assessed component, often considered the indicator, but it's also helpful to know something about the joint status of the ecosystem that will be evaluated. We need to know something about the key pressures that then need to be evaluated in the risk assessment, and also that we use to build our network structure. And of course, in terms of the sensitivity, we need to know something about the indicator responses to each of the pressures, and also ideally know something about the interactions between the pressures that might also lead to tipping points and regime shifts. So when looking now at the status of the system with respect to management objectives, there are two different types of approaches. One is looking at the individual time series, or looking at the joint time series together. Individual trend, for the individual time series, one usually looks at the trend, whether there's a positive trend or not. Here you have also on the left, it's an assessment that was done for the Baltic Sea, where you have every cell represents an indicator for a specific sub-region in the Baltic Sea, and with the arrow that shows whether there is a positive trend, a decreasing trend, or no trend. And red and green refers to this current status in reference to a baseline and whether a certain threshold was passed or not. And so for that, you also need to do some threshold analysis to say whether that's the indicator is in a current bad state or in a good state. If the approaches for looking at joint trends usually don't need a threshold analysis, they just purely look at the joint trends. The most common approach is here an ordination technique to reduce the dimension. Here, this was done by Lindegren and co-authors for the California current system, and they applied a principal component analysis, for example. So the single univariate trend analysis, one thing might be a bit easier to apply. I mean, there are different modeling approaches you might be also familiar with. You can look at linear trends or non-linear trends. There are specific time series approaches as well. However, the overall problem also, even with those simple statistical models, is that to really be able to identify a trend in the data, you need to have enough data points. It has been shown that at least 30 years, typically, if you have annual data, everything below, you hardly are able to detect a trend. And also, if there is temporal autocorrelation in the data, that can also confound the signal of the test. So there might be no trend, but the statistical tests tell you there is a trend just purely because of the temporal autocorrelation. So that's something also one has to test before one can apply those methods. And when it comes to defining targets or thresholds, the most simple approach that is currently used in the EU for the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, where we also have to evaluate the current status in each of the systems, is that you have a baseline, which can be either an unimpacted site, or it can be some historical data that one has, or if both is not available, one uses the first years of the time series, or worst case, there is no time series and one has just recent data, and that is then used as a baseline. And the target is set as some range from the baseline. Or if that's also not possible to do, then the target is to have an increasing trend or the decreasing trend. Alternatively, which is also now tested, is to use breakpoint or threshold algorithms on the time series analysis to see whether there are abrupt changes, which might indicate also that the system has reached some unstable state where like a certain level might cause a shift where it's difficult to move that indicator out again. And one can then say, well, the beginning of the time series is then the reference, the time period before that shift that is detected, and calculate, let's say, the standard deviation of the confidence interval and use that one. Here, this is, for example, spread by spawning stock biomass over time. And you see that in the early 80s, there was pretty much a crash of spread in the North Sea. And if one uses here in light blue, the lower standard deviation, like 2 standard deviation down, then one still is not hasn't reached the target that we would ideally like to have. So that is also one way of doing it. In terms of the breakpoint analysis, there are different algorithms what one has to choose from, and it also depends what one likes to look at. In my example, we looked at the overall mean change, but one can also look at the changes in the variance, because it has been also shown that time series that show changes in the variance and autocorrelation also are closer to reaching a tipping point. So that can be also interesting to look at. One can also look at changes in the relationship and changes in multivariate time series. And there are different R packages that can be used. And often you can use several of those algorithms for looking at the same type of change. And it's important also to know that they are not always consistent. And ideally, it's good to use a multi-model approach or like an ensemble approach to then say kind of this is the time period where you're most certain that a change has occurred. So when it comes to multivariate trend analysis, the most simple way would be to calculate the Euclidean distance. This is what Ted and co-authors also did in 2013 in their paper, where they say, okay, when you have, for example, 3 dimensions there, you have copperpot biomass, I think it was phytoplankton production, and then abundances of seabirds. And you have in this 3-dimensional space, you can show the trajectory in time, and you have to choose a specific year. Typically, you would use the first year of your time series as your baseline or reference, and then calculate in this 3-dimensional space the difference between every year towards that reference period. And then you get this time series here, and you see that it has changed. The distance has increased from that initial year more and more, but in the latest years, the change wasn't that strong anymore. And one can also look at the difference between each year from the overall trend to see how much this fluctuation has increased or not. So this is a bit more simpler approach where one also reduces several dimensions into one. This is easier now conceptually to think of with 3 dimensions, but you can of course do this also with 100 variables as well. This is also kind of the way or the concept in ordination techniques. It's more like a reduction into 2 or 3 main components based on association or distance measures. There are also different types. They all have their pros and cons. There is a shiny app from a former PhD student at our institute that developed this shiny app where you can play around. You can use a demo data, or you can upload your own data and apply different ordination techniques as an integrated trend analysis and compare them, and to see also whether the results are robust or not. When it comes to driver detection, of course, you can apply simple or single response variables. There are different types of models. They can be linear or non-linear. They can be explicit time series models where you also include an exogenous driver. However, they're not as useful to look at cumulative effect or interaction or trade-offs between indicator targets. For that, one needs to have more complex models like multivariate autoregressive models, structural equation models, and so on. But they take more time and cannot be run necessarily quickly on hundreds of indicators. So it's often good to have a mix of both. But what is important is that one looks also at nonlinear responses and not use only the linear approaches, because it has been shown that particularly in systems that have undergone major shifts or regime shifts, that they show not so much a linear response to small changes in the driver, but rather abrupt or discontinuous. Here's an example. So if there would be a linear response, there would be a constant decrease of the state of the ecosystem with increases in the driver. There can be also some threshold in the driver where the ecosystem state suddenly jumps to a lower state. Or the hysteresis effect, or discontinuous one, is when you have this inverse S-shaped curve, where you have at high levels of the driver, suddenly it's just quick change in the state, but you need to reduce or lower the pressure of the driver to very, very low levels to actually be able to get the system back into the original state. And this has been shown for many systems, like here on the left, we have coral reefs, from a coral reef dominated system to a macro algae dominated system. We have seen this also in the Baltic Sea, where the system has changed from a cod dominated system to a spread dominated, or in the Black Sea from a planktivorous fish to a jellyfish dominated system. And for both systems, threshold approaches of statistical models, where one looks at interactions between different stressors and defining different regimes. Here, for example, on the left, we have two different regimes of cod biomass, and then we see that the effect of spread, which is a planktivorous fish, on the zooplankton it feeds on, that is different depending on the regime of cod. And the same has been also shown here for phytoplankton, and then also for other trophic levels, where at low levels of planktivorous fish, the climate index or climate condition had a strong or significant effect, whereas at low regimes of fish biomass, then the zooplankton had an effect on the fish, on the phytoplankton. But those kind of methods are required to really see the interactions between the different pressures, and they can be also sometimes pretty abrupt. This type of models, doing threshold formulations of statistical models, are useful to, if I come back here, to identify those abrupt shifts as well, but to really identify tipping points that often requires more advanced statistical techniques. One more recent version model that is very useful, which is based on catastrophe theory, is the so-called Cusp model, where you can test for an interaction between two drivers. Can be also sometimes a combination here. Camilla Squarto-Warzo was a PhD at our institute. She looked at the combination of sea surface temperature and fishing mortality on the spawning stock biomass of cod. And we can see that at low levels here of temperature, the effect of fishing mortality is mainly linear, but at high sea surface temperature levels, the effect of fishing mortality, it becomes this discontinuous curve here, the inverse S curve. So the effect of fishing mortality on the stock is modulated by the sea surface temperature. And so those kind of approaches are nice to figure out how they can interact, and they can help later on also to feed back into the fully quantitative risk assessment. So in terms of the qualitative and semi-quantitative risk assessment, those kind of models and approaches can be helpful first when one does single indicator risk assessments, for example, to identify what are the pressures that we actually have to look at. And what are the sensitivity scores? They can be helpful to either to give us a better judgment on the risk, on the scores we should give, or we can use actually the model outcome as well to evaluate the risk, the sensitivity score. And a master student of mine has recently looked in her master thesis whether there are differences between a model-based scoring or a judgment based on literature review, and found that mostly it's rather consistent, so one can apply, depending on whether there's data available or not, one can apply a mix of both. And that then can be helpful if one has those individual indicator assessments. One can combine them and look at what is the combination of the different pressures on the different indicator, and are there specific pressures that are in general posing a higher risk to all the indicators or not. Here we see, for example, yellow means high risk, that cod and also the diatom dinoflagellate ratio indicator are highest at risk and maybe require more management measures than the other indicators. And in the semi or fully quantitative risk assessment, the knowledge or the model outcome can help building, first of all, this model and knowing like which nodes should be connected. And also when it comes to the parameterization of the linkages, one can use the parameters from the individual analysis. And if one has those models built, one can do also some scenarios and look at what happens if we increase, or like if we have low fishing mortality or high fishing mortality, low nutrient input or high nutrient input, or low temperature change and high temperature change, how much is it likely that the bird indicator will change and decrease or increase in the next few years? So it's kind of a combination. Knowing something about the status and the relationship helps then also to improve our quantitative risk assessment and then to do scenario analysis. Our aim is also to develop in our package where we have various of the methods I kind of touched upon today, and also have a web application based on Shiny that does the analysis that will be also here in the IEA tools. So for those who are not so much good in coding, you can also then apply the web application and just upload your data and then let the application do the analysis for you. So that's the ultimate goal, but that is, of course, that requires some time, but stay tuned. With that, I'd like to thank you for listening, and questions will be answered later on.
Thank you, Saskia. Very nice overview of the different methods and tools we have to analyze these complex interactions in the ecosystems. Mm-hmm. And while Roland is coming up, yes. And I think I'll pass the word directly to you, Roland. Now we can see the end of the presentation.
Oh. Okay.
I think it's still in the non-presentation. Now it is. Yes, sorry, maybe it's my delay.
Okay.
Take it. Yeah.
So good morning, afternoon, and evening to all the attendees. My name is Roland Proud, and I'm going to be presenting on biogeography of the Atlantic Ocean, and specifically in regards to the Mission Atlantic project. So just a bit about who am I. I'm a postdoc research fellow from the University of St Andrews in Scotland. And that's on the east coast, about an hour and 10 minutes north of Edinburgh, indicated by that red point there. This is sort of the view we have from our office of the town and the East Sands beach. And our office has just gone under refurbishment, and so it looks directly over the beach and the sea. And if you're lucky enough, you've got one of those offices right on the front. It has a nice view. I sadly don't. So this talk focuses on biogeography. So I'm going to give some background first and then lead into what we're doing in Mission Atlantic. Biogeography is the branch of biology that deals with the partitioning of land or ocean into distinct areas, regions, or provinces based on some defining characteristic, whether that's biological, chemical, or physical, or some combination thereof. And so the first biogeography was defined by Mary Somerville, who was a Scottish scientist and writer, and defined her biogeography based on 9 latitudinal Homozoic zones. So split the ocean into 9 zones based on temperature and salinity profiles. And you can see her portrait hanging in the National Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh, if you're ever visiting. And now a quick brief history on oceanography. It started really with the HMS Challenger in 1872. The Challenger went out for 4 years and collected samples all over the ocean, some of which are still being analysed today. The expedition report alone was around 30,000 pages and took 20 years to write. And then post-Challenger, these samples were analysed in coastal labs all over the world, including labs such as Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. Post-World War II, modern oceanography was born, and that was mainly driven by US and Soviet navies first, or competitive thirst for knowledge. And then came this era in the late 50s and 60s, where there was lots of international collaborations between scientists, where they studied regional scale surveys in different ocean basins. And then in the 60s and 70s, with the technological revolution of solid state electronics, everything changed. So this included instrumentation, data collection, and data analysis. But perhaps the most important change came just after this, and this was the awareness of the public that we as a society can have a negative impact on the environment through pollution, through fish stock depletion, and climate change. So that really changed how we looked at science and changed from more of a blue sky science to agenda driven. We have to do something about these problems that we have caused. And then came the era of satellites and modern biogeography. So in 1978, Nimbus 7 satellite was launched, and on board, we had a coastal zone color scanner. And this could make measurements of concentrations of photosynthetic pigments, so we could map out concentrations of plant biomass across the globe. And on the right side here, you can see an image from collated images from that satellite, from the instrument. And it shows you the distribution of plant biomass in the North Atlantic. And it has that classic pattern that you see in the oceans, where there's low production in the gyres, and then there's higher production in the coastal regions and in the subarctic. Alan Longhurst took these measurements, and in his seminal ecological geography of the sea, devised a biogeography comprised of over 50 provinces based on those measurements of chlorophyll, plant biomass, and also information on regional oceanography, such as the positions of the fronts and the water masses. And a key question in ocean biogeography is, do these surface provinces that are based on surface data, do they map onto the subsurface ecosystems? Because the ocean is a vertical and three-dimensional domain, and it has many ecosystems layered together. It's not obvious if the surface provinces would map onto the subsurface ecosystems. So unfortunately, we can't use satellites to make observations of the subsurface. We have to go out and make measurements using vessels. So typically that would involve fishing or trawling using nets to take biological samples, using acoustics. So that's a technology that's come out of the Second World War submarine sonar. So we can use acoustics. It's analogous to sonar, but it's just a bit more sensitive. So as well as detecting the seabed, you can make detections of organisms in the water column, from copepods to whales. And then you can also use probes and underwater vehicles, imagery, videography, and eDNA. So eDNA is a relatively new tech and involves taking water samples and looking for DNA traces within the water. And it looks to be very promising in years to come. And from these observations, we can learn a lot about the deeper ecosystems. So typically, what you get in the mesopelagic zone, which is the zone between 200 and 1,000 meters, it's often called the twilight zone because during the daytime, there's very little light in this zone. And that's precisely why there's a community of organisms there, because they're hiding from visual predators. And then at dusk, they migrate up in unison and feed at the surface, and then migrate back down to the deep at dawn. And this process is very important in terms of carbon cycling, because it plays a role in transporting carbon from the surface of the ocean down into the deep, and eventually it will be sequestered in the seabed. In the figure shown just below, you can see an echogram. This is an observation made by scientific sonar. So using scientific sonar, we can make detections of these organisms. And in this community, so the bulk of the biomass is made up of zooplankton, fish, squid, jellyfish, etc. And the main component of that biomass, we believe, is myctophid or lanternfish, around 250 species globally. And recent predictions suggest there could be an absolutely huge biomass of these fish in the ocean, but those predictions are very uncertain. And it's driven a lot of interest in this family of fish species as a potential commercial resource, as a fishery, but perhaps they're more important as delivering an ecosystem service, providing this transport of carbon and energy from the surface down into the deep. And then finally, there's this figure on the top right. It's from a publication in 1968, and it illustrates the complexity of the vertical domain in the ocean. It's often presented in models that this vertical migration is quite simple. It's organisms at depth, they migrate to the surface and then back down. But actually, it's more of a complex interplay between lots of predators and prey interacting at different depths. And so the pathway of carbon down into the deep is not straightforward. And there's a lot of study at the moment in this area. So more recently, there have been some attempts to map these deeper communities and produce mesopelagic biogeographies. From left to right, we have a biogeography, this is now focused on the Atlantic Ocean, that was based on sonar data. And in the middle, one based on biological samples, and on the right, biogeochemistry. So we can see that there are differences between these approaches. And also importantly, you can see on the left that Longhurst surface provinces do not actually map onto the deeper provinces, the deeper habitats. So I haven't mentioned climate change yet, but this of course plays a major role, especially now in a period of such rapid change. And the warming oceans are reshaping fisheries across the globe. So as the oceans warm, tropical fish are moving poleward, and that's changing fish distributions everywhere. And a consequence of this is it's causing conflicts over new fisheries won and lost. So as fish distributions change, of course, nations will begin to acquire new fisheries and also lose fisheries where the fish are moving to other waters. An example of this is happening in the North Atlantic with the mackerel stock, which has been moving northward. And now Iceland fished that stock. And so there is some conflict between the nations now that lay claim to the mackerel stock. So this is a challenge for the future of sustainable fisheries. And of course, these fish that are moving, it's not just changing in the horizontal domain, but also in the vertical domain. On the bottom left is a biogeography of tuna and billfish. From left to right, yellowfin, big eye, albacore, swordfish, bluefin tuna, and it shows you their distributions. So the x-axis is moving from the tropics to the temperate regions, and the y-axis depth. So it shows you that their distributions are depth dependent. And as the horizontal distributions change for these species, of course, their vertical distributions are going to change and have consequences. In the future, and based on different climate scenarios, biogeographies are predicted to change drastically. And where that change is predicted to be most significant is around the equatorial region. As you can see on this map, the red splurges show areas of significant predicted change in biogeographic provinces. So where provinces will be lost, where provinces will emerge. So one of the questions in Mission Atlantic is, how can we study this dynamic system, the system of such change and complexity, both at the surface and in the deeper environment? And if this video works, yes, so this is a wave glider, and this is one of the novel techniques that we want to employ in Mission Atlantic. Essentially uses wave energy to move. And we are able to attach instruments to these devices and program them and send them on missions to anywhere in the ocean we like. And the advantage is that they're relatively cheap compared to vessel time. And you could employ hundreds of these, in theory, hundreds of these wave gliders to go out and make observations all over the ocean. And you don't have the logistical constraints that you do have with a vessel. So with a wave glider, we can target specific boundaries, specific biogeographic boundaries and features, and have the wave glider move backward and forward over them, such that we can capture high temporal and spatial resolution detail of these features and study them. So one of the possible routes that we're going to carry out on Mission Atlantic is to deploy a wave glider in the Azores and have it move from Gran Canaria to Cabo Verde, Ascension Island, to Cabo Frio. Of course, this is subject to change, and this is something that's being discussed at the moment. But what is clear is that we're going to target areas of change, boundaries, welling zones, etc. And on these wave gliders, we'll have scientific sonar, which will make observations of the midwater communities, the communities of fish, the squid, the zooplankton, etc., that are performing these vertical migrations. And then along with that information, that data, we will combine it with observations, both historic and current, including oceanographic surveys, deep sea glider deployments, and benthic surveys as well. I'm now going to spend a few minutes talking about a collaborator's work, EM and his group at AZTI. They are modeling the 3D fish species distributions, and this work directly links into the work we're doing on biogeography. So their objective is to study the habitats of 30 main commercial Atlantic fish species, including pelagics, coastal, demersal species, and also tuna. And they'll examine 3D movements of these species through the different Atlantic biomes and regions. This work involves collating a lot of information from a lot of different databases, including catch information from FAO catch data and other sources, which include illegal, unregulated, and unreported catch for these fish species. Mining other databases to get species presence and absence data from OBIS and GBIF. And these data also include depth distribution. So not only you get the horizontal distribution of the species, but also their depth distribution. And you can see in this example for Atlantic mackerel that their distribution is impinging on the coast of Iceland. They will be performing ecological niche-based modeling, which is essentially relating the species distribution to the environment. And to do that, they are using variables from the World Ocean Atlas. So download this information and relate it to those species patterns. And in the example here, you can see a profile, the sea temperature, through the mid-Atlantic ridge in the Atlantic. And then for each one of these species, they're going to collate all of that information together. So the distribution, both horizontal and depth, and then relate those distributions to those environmental variables and look where there are changes and produce species distribution models based on an ecological niche framework. So in summary, what we're trying to do is move towards a more holistic ecosystem approach. We need to understand what's happening at the surface and how it links to the deeper ecosystems. And we're going to do that by using novel observation techniques such as wave gliders, and then link in modeling, 3D modeling. And then this all then links back to prey data that we'll get from oceanographic cruises to get a more holistic understanding of the ecosystem, which of course can feed into management and ecosystem assessment. Okay, thank you for listening. I'll pass you back over.
Thank you very much, Roland. Very interesting presentation. Yeah, we will come back with questions later on, I can see. But I asked Sergio to share his presentation and to start showing the video as well. and the microphone.
Oh, okay, you're seeing it?
It's all set, yeah.
Okay. So I will continue in these ideas of large-scale biodiversity and connectivity. Now we'll focus more on reef fish. So we are in shallow parts than Roland showed you before. So it's easier, a little bit easier. Let's go for it. We have been for 10 years or so now working with reef fish biogeography and evolution in the Atlantic Ocean, and so we have been studying the relationships between the biogeographical areas in the Atlantic. And we now have an updated database that is showing that the three southern mid-Atlantic ridge islands are kind of getting together in this analysis. And it's nice. It's in general, it's more linked to the Western Atlantic, but you will see that some evolutionary connections with Africa is also happening. So it's very interesting place to study these isolated islands, and they are all these open ocean oceanic islands that are really different from the surrounding environment in the open ocean. And for a while, we applied general island biogeography rules that was most used in terrestrial habitats, but we are now using it for marine environments. It's nice to check richness, endemism rates, and so on the islands of the Atlantic, the oceanic islands of the Atlantic. And we now know that these very isolated and small islands have large percentage of endemic species. This is an example for fish, but it is valid for other groups as well. For instance, the St. Peter and St. Paul's archipelago, it's a tiny island from Brazil that is very isolated too. So we have some species that we have endemics that I will show later, and also some species like this queen angelfish that have different color patterns in the island. So it's very interesting what the isolation could cause to certain species. This is endemic species from there. Another one. And Ascension Island have the same idea of being very isolated and with different endemic species. So we went there, and we are now working on genetics and stuff from this endemic fish, like this kind of a chocolate butterfly fish. And as one can see, they are close related to the species in the other islands. So these very isolated islands, but they have some connection, at least evolutionary connection between them. This is Chaetodon, another butterfly fish endemic. As the name Chaetodon sanctellini shows us, And this is more of these results from biogeography of different groups like gastropods and seaweeds, and relationships with age, area, and isolation. We now know that many species are new endemics that are relatively new species comparing to other places. So this varies worldwide, but we have more new endemics in our area here in South Atlantic. But another way to look at it is with the functional approach, instead of just going in taxonomic aspects of different species here and there, but we can also work with different traits for each species. And then we have some kind of functional biogeography to work on. And in this case, we have, for instance, calculations of functional richness in relation to isolation of the islands. So isolated islands of the Mid-Atlantic region have smaller functional richness, as we can imagine, but they have larger functional evenness, another calculation from this functional approach. So we have this warmer colorations here, close to red. And then we have also an effect of functional vulnerability. Like in Ascension and St. Helena, for example, we have many combinations of traits with just one species doing that job in the environment. So it's kind of worrying, and we have to be very careful with that. Here in Brazil, we have a large scale and long-term research program already, working with data sets, time series. We are starting from 8-9 years from now. We are working with underwater visual censuses to get biomass and density of fishes. And we also work with managers to try to establish more NPAs on those islands here in Brazil. And we have a paper published in, now it's 2 years ago, that we tried to assemble a lot of information from the different islands. And now we have some idea of species richness and comparing the Atlantic with the tropical Eastern Pacific islands, such as Galapagos here and other islands there. Density of individuals, biomass, and now we know that biomass is related to isolation. Larger biomass when the islands are more isolated, most likely because we have lower human influence. As well, we have some interaction with productivity, with area, and so on. And within the Mission Atlantic project, we have the case study SOMAR, led by Mary Gazala and me, that we will keep working, and we're going to St. Helena to explore more detailed information there. So connectivity patterns, integrated ecosystem assessment, and modeling future scenarios for these isolated islands. And the idea will be to combine all these kinds of information, such as the functional traits with abundance, biomass, even interaction of fish with phylogenetic data, and then we can start to understanding more of these islands. For example, the The Ophioblaenius, a small cryptobenthic fish that are spread all over the Atlantic. It's a very interesting genus to try to understand more about the evolutionary scenarios and connectivity among these islands. And it's interesting that we have, when we compare with the age of the islands, for instance, St. Helena is 15 million years old, and Ascension is it's a very new island with just 1 million year old. So we are trying to understand more on these molecular clocks and the diversification of those fish. And it's interesting that sometimes, in this case here, the clade that first arrived in St. Helena arrived there more into 8 million years old, so the island was there already. But in some cases, the lineage appeared to be older than the one in Ascension Island, for instance. And they have a connectivity here from Ascension to St. Helena. So this is something to work in more detail in the near future to understand this ecological population connectivity going on. And this could happen in different clades. This one is a wrasse that's very interesting, that they have endemic species in Africa, and then in St. Helena, and then Ascension. If we put them in this chronological framework, then we have St. Helena with 15 million years old, Ascension very new. So the idea here is that the ancestral from this group came from the Gulf of Guinea to St. Helena, and then to Ascension. And it's interesting that one species, this Thalassoma St. Helena, is now found in Ascension too. So we have an endemic species from Ascension, and the species from St. Helena arrived later on in Ascension. So we are trying to understand more of all these evolutionary scenarios to couple geological information from the age of the islands and the seamounts around it to try to understand the evolution of certain groups in the islands. We have other interesting group here, some butterfly fishes like this group here probably came in the last 1 to 2 million years from the Indian Ocean. So this is interesting that from the Indian Ocean, sometimes some species enter the Atlantic, and this is very nice to understand. The Benguela current sometimes allow this passage here from linkage from South Africa and so on. So it's very nice to study these influences here. And we may have something like that in this planktivore clade too, that may be related to Indo-Pacific fish that entered the Atlantic through the Agulhas rings from Mozambique and then entered the Atlantic. Another group that we have here, another small fish, this is Cartella group. If we zoom here on the endemics for the Atlantic islands, then we have one species in Ascension, another one in St. Helena, endemics. But the separation of them is about 6 to 7 million years old. It's interesting that it's older than the age of Ascension Island. So We have all these things to think about. If there is any seamount around Ascension Island that it's older than Ascension, then they colonize it, then this seamount submerged, and then Ascension appeared, and then it arrived there. This is something of a puzzle that we are trying to understand more in the near future. And again, this newly arrived endemics, and we have all these vagrant species going from one place to the other. We are seeing that in the last 10 years, for example, 10 to 20 years, we are seeing more and more some species going to one place to the other. So it seems that it's very dynamic, even in our ecological time frame. So we're keeping an eye on that. For instance, a lot of tropical species are arriving recently in the Canary Islands. It may be related to warming temperatures in the Canaries. So we'll keep an eye on all these distributions. So I would like to thank the Air Center for this opportunity here, and all the current funding, and Mission Atlantic, and everyone, Patrizio, for the invitation. And I guess I put some ideas on what we will be working in the next few years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sergio, also to open up this perspective of how evolutionary biology can help in assessing the status of the ecosystem in these open ocean islands, but also more in general in different type of ecosystems. We'll come back with questions also about these human effects on these islands, but I will invite David to share the presentation.
Okay, I've lost the share button.
Yeah, that can happen. Let's find it again. I think it's down to the bottom of the Zoom where you have participant chat, then there is the share.
Okay, I'm not seeing it. Can you see it now?
Not yet, but maybe it's because it's coming.
Nothing's ever easy. Oh, sorry, apologies. There it is.
Yeah, now it's up.
Good, thank you. Can you see it okay?
Not yet in presentation mode.
Okay. Apologies to everybody. I'm not a master of these things.
That's perfectly fine. I think if you go to the slideshow there, probably you have more options.
No, it's not coming up. It came up fine earlier.
No. Yeah, it seems like you have it running somehow, but then not on your main screen.
How about that?
Yeah, now it's in the presentation mode, but we just see the wrong, if you swap between, yeah, that's perfect now.
Yeah, thank you very much. So thank you very much for having me to this session. It's a great pleasure to be here. So this presentation is sort of based on something I did for Mission Atlantic back at the start, which is talking about IEAs, integrated ecosystem assessments, and what is it good for. And we'll look at how we're using IEAs in Mission Atlantic. So I've co-authored this with my postdoc, Debbie Podreski, who's actually done most of the work here. So we'll start off at the very beginning. This is what has now become known as the Levin cycle, named after Phil Levin, an American scientist. And it shows you the number of different steps. I'm going to have to see if I can I can't see all of this, but never mind. And it's through from defining and scoping your goals, develop ecosystem indicators, risk analysis, and then through to assessment of status. And Saskia talked a lot about this before. And what we're trying to do in this part of the project is develop a holistic view of the world, well, perhaps not the world, but our case study areas across the Atlantic. And it's a sort of combination of this full-blown integrated ecosystem assessment, which, as you can see, is not something you do in 1 or 2 or 3 years. It's a cyclical phenomenon where you move backwards and forwards, monitoring, changing a management plan, coming back again. You've also seen these diagrams, so I'm not going to go into in great detail, but in my perception of integrated ecosystem analysis is an integral part of carry out an ecological risk assessment. So you can use the methodologies to develop an understanding of which components are at risk and how and from what and in what way. And you can then put scores on that. So this is the qualitative and semi-quantitative components of what Saskia was talking about. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So we use a thing called the ODEM system, the Options for Ecosystem-Based Marine Management, which is named after an EU project from some years ago, and the references at the bottom. And what this does is it maps sectors, that's human activity sectors, the pressures they produce, and the ecological characteristics, and it maps them against each other. Now it's done in the first pass, which is what we've done so far, by what we call a panel assessment. So you get together a group of experts and you then run an analysis, you run an appraisal of each of the sectors, the pressures and the ecological components or characteristics. Now, that makes it sound purely qualitative. It's not just based on expert judgment. Many of those judgments that are made are actually based on data. We did this over a number of months and we had specific large meetings to fill it out. And what you get is a combination of some very hard data where you have in-area quantitative data for a particular relationship. And then other ones are just, I wouldn't say blind guesses, informed guesses by good scientists about what's going on. And that's one of the critical keys about this, because we're trying to get a picture of how everything interacts. So that panel establishes the links between things. So this is the links between a sector and the pressure they produce, and then what those pressures do to the ecological characteristics or components we're talking about. Having established whether or not there is a link between a particular sector and a particular pressure, we then score those and review them. I'll come back to that in a minute on the scoring. And then you can use that combination of all the established links and the scores of them to prioritize what you do next, where you move up to the semi-quantitative or up to the sort of thing that Saskia is talking about. So you'll see how this evolves as I go on through the presentation. So the scores we put into each pressure linkage pathway or linkage chain, as we often call them, cover 5 different things. Extent, spatial extent. So within your study area, how much of a particular pressure or the activity that produces that pressure, is it across the whole area or part of it or only a very small part? The frequency of the occurrence of that pressure, is it occasional, something like an oil spill, or is it everywhere all the time, such as fishing? We also score the degree of impact, which is just how major that impact is, from a minor impact through to population level effects. We also score resilience, and that comes back to some of the stuff Saskia talked about as well. But at the moment, resilience in this framework is principally longevity. It's how long an animal lives. Longer lived animals have lower resilience. But hopefully we're going to expand that a lot more in this project. And finally, persistence. So that's what happens when you take the pressure away. Does the activity of that pressure still continue? The classic example for that would be something like tributyl tin, which we stopped using in ship paint 25, 30 years ago, and yet it's still there in the environment and causing impacts. So I'm just going to show you an example from the one that we did in the Irish waters, EEZ. We're in the process of updating this, but Debbie did a lot of the work for this a few years ago. and the publications at the bottom. So the Irish EEZ is quite large, but constrained by the bloody British over to the right hand side. So we looked at 16 different sectors, and I'm not going to list these for you. You can imagine what they are. They range from fishing through to land-based industry. We developed 23 pressures that come from those, and then 20 ecological components or characteristics that are linked together. So that results in 16,000 odd, almost 17,000 potential interactions between a sector, a pressure, and an ecological component, which is scary to score, as you can imagine. But we have done this, and we've done it now across the Atlantic, and I'll show you some of that in a minute. However, what you do tend to find is that not all the linkages are actually operational. It just, a link doesn't happen between a particular sector and a pressure, or a pressure and an ecological component. So we established interaction links between 1900 of those. So it's still quite a lot to do the scoring on, but it's a bit easier. Now, I don't want to go into any detail of that. It's a fairly complex exercise. It's in categories. We don't try and score it on a continuous basis. It's basically, for most of them, there's three levels of interaction. It's either, in simple terms, it's low, medium, and high. It's more complex than that, but let's not focus on that. So what's it good for? Why would you want to do one of these analyses? What does it deliver for you? So first of all, it's the context. It's one pressure in many. So if you ask almost anybody on the street what the main pressure on the marine environment is, they'll either tell you it's pollution, or they'll tell you it's fishing. And generally, fishing gets the big bad name. And we started doing this work to put the fishing pressure into the context of all the other known pressures. It allows you to prioritize, to put your limited resources on the key threats. It allows you to link to policy, and I'll show you an example of that. So we're working in the European Union, and we're linking it to the Marine Strategy Framework Directive in Europe, but it can apply to any national or international policy drivers. It also allows you to map through from the activities to the pressures to the ecosystem components and identify goods and services. And we're currently doing that at that level. We're just developing that work now. It is also very good for involving stakeholders. It both conveys the complexity and how the system simplifies when we do the analysis. So we've worked with some stakeholders that really had no scientific background, but they could help us populate and inform this analysis. It also takes you through to social ecological systems and links to that arena as well. And it sort of gives us a start on cumulative effects. Cumulative effects is one of the holy grails of marine ecosystem science, how things interact, how two pressures interact. And we're not there yet, but we're heading towards it. And then finally, it identifies where you think there's something seriously important risk, such as, there's a big risk of something happening. And if it happens, it's pretty bad, like dropping a nuclear bomb into the water. It's not likely to happen, but if it does happen, it's a big problem. And so it allows us to identify gaps. So just go back to that list again. The main context for this is to start providing advice to policymakers and managers. And this is an example of what ICES, the International Council for the Exploration of the Seas, is doing at the moment in what they call ecosystem overviews. And so it's down the left-hand side, you've got a number of human activities. The main ones, fishing, comes out quite clearly in our waters, the Celtic seas. But there's other human activities of importance. They produce a set of pressures, those 5 particular pressures. Selective extraction is basically fishing, but abrasion from beating up the seabed, smothering from raising up the sand and so on. And it then maps through to various states of the habitats, the food webs, and so on and so forth. So it allows you to present that quite simply. We also have an interactive Shiny app that allows you to do it yourself, choose what you think is important. Now, this is the full story. And this is what I use in most of my presentations, including to my students. And this is what we call a horrendogram, because it shows all the connections that are live in our Celtic Seas ecosystem analysis. So along the top, the curved bit has got all the human activity sectors, human activities that are going to impact on the marine environment. And they range from agriculture to coastal infrastructure, even to military, and includes research, which in our first pass turned out to be the most damaging thing in the whole world. Along the middle, you've got all the different pressures. So it can be introducing litter, it can be introducing noise, it can be causing bycatch, you know, the whole gamut. So these are intended to be inclusive. Everything should be included. And then along the bottom, you've got the different sectors, sorry, the different ecosystem components that we include in here. It's a bit heavy on charismatic megafauna because the origins of this process came out of the Oslo Paris organization. But it can be done in any number of ways. There's no constraints on this. The red lines are to differentiate from the black is all the linkages for fishing. So you can see it's heavily linked to almost everything. So it provides a context for the whole thing. You can now see everything in context, but it also allows you to establish priorities. All these links have been populated with those 5 different criteria that I showed you earlier with the spatial extent, temporal extent, and so on. So it allows you to establish priorities. So you can take the top 2% scoring links, that's what we've done here, and it allows you to identify key threats. And there you go, there's the key threats. So what we've done is we've taken only 59 links, which constitute the top 2% of priorities. Again, you can see fishing is pretty critical there, but this explains 64% of the total risk score to the marine environment. So you're now being able to focus down on what you really want to do something about. And so this can link into policy as well. So this is the same horrendogram without so much color in it. And along the bottom, we've linked it to the Marine Strategy Framework Directive in Europe, which includes a number of descriptors like biological diversity, trying to maintain that, how to maintain food webs and so on. So we can identify the links through from a human activity to how much threat it poses to a particular aspect of the marine ecosystem. Not the specific ones we have out there, but the ones covered under these descriptors and criteria. I'm trying to remember why I put this figure in. Yeah, so it can also be prioritized, as I showed you before. You can see the effect that fishing is basically hitting biological diversity, commercial species, food webs, the seafloor, and it's introducing litter. We'll come back to that again and again.
Sergio, I think you have the microphone open.
Okay, I thought there was a ghost in my machine. So I'm going to show you another approach to all this, which is the conceptual model approach, which is, so what we've shown you is heavily numerical. It's completed by experts, they populate all those linkages. It's incredibly complicated, and it's not something that's easy to take down to talk to the stakeholders, people are really interested in. So this is an example I'm showing here for the Irish Sea, which is between Ireland and Brexit land. And it was a whole group of people. We sat them down in a room like this with coffee and stuff and made flip charts and so on. And we looked at what their response to these type of understandings that we developed with the ODEP. And so you see the same stuff here again. So you've got 4 different sectors along the top: wastewater, fishing, land-based industry, and shipping, which came out in our analysis for the Irish Sea. You've also got the pressures they introduced: litter, abrasion, bycatch, and so on. And you then link it through to those, again, so those descriptors under our European marine strategy. Now, what you can then do with the stick, that came from our scientific analysis. You can then take it through to start adding what the stakeholders see as the ecosystem goods and services. And so you start to see here things like local food provision, aesthetics and recreation. this is a fairly mocked up example, but we've been developing this a lot with stakeholders. You can then add in the next one, which is socioeconomic values, things that people want out of the marine ecosystem. And you get issues like compliance, safety at sea, sense of place and community and tradition. Each of the links here in this particular context are populated as positive or negative and given some strength, but they're directional and have strength. And you can model from that using this type of information to look at what would happen if you did something to let's say selective species extraction or land-based industry. How would that change the picture? And the final example, because I'm a fisheries scientist, is looking at fisheries management measures. So things like quota or marine protected areas and so on. So you get this, again, you start to build up a horrendogram, but actually because you build it in steps, it's much easier for stakeholders to come along with you on that trip. I can't actually see the top of my screen, but this is basically about cumulative effects. And what you're looking at here is what's often termed a bow tie diagram. And descriptor 8 in the European Marine Strategy is about contaminants, and those we've split into synthetics and non-synthetics. And so you can see the linkages again, who's introducing these things. So fishing has a role to play, but so do things like land-based industry, wastewater and so on. So you can split it down to give you this idea of where you need to look at cumulative effects, or at least where you need to look at the cumulative effects for the major pressures. And the gaps in our, where does it identify gaps? What it does is it links these key threats to lack of knowledge. And of course, it then allows us to do more paid research funded by the European Union and others. Now, I just wanted to go quickly at the end of this to show you where we're getting to in Mission Atlantic. So you've seen all the case studies, ranging from the Mid-Atlantic Ridge to Brazil, South Africa, and our little Irish waters up here. And you've got these things going on, these type of analysis following a standard model approach. And we've built that linkage framework in all the case studies so far. We have scored the links in most of them. It's just an example again. In fact, the only one we haven't fully scored yet, I think, is Norway. But the rest of it is being done. We've scored all the links. We can now start to do the prioritization. And that allows us to identify the key risks. I'm not sure if seaspiracy is a major risk, so let's move on. And so for this is specifically for our case study. So what we found is that fishing is a key risk in the whole system, and it introduces all those different types of pressures: seabed abrasion, bycatch, incidental loss, species extraction, and litter. Now that's not a surprise in a simple "that's what it does" sense. What is important is that those are the most serious effects in terms of impact on the marine environment across the whole board. Agricultural runoff is a key one, as you'd imagine, particularly introduction of synthetic compounds, but also in eutrophication terms. And then industry, land-based industry, shipping, and tourism and leisure are three different sectors which introduce litter as a major pressure. Now, when we did this, we tried very hard not to be normative about this. We actually looked at it carefully. How important is litter and what's the effect of it? It was all done on fixed frameworks, and litter still came out as one of the highest deals in the marine environment. From that, we've built the literature and the data support tool to go behind that. So in as many cases as possible, we've populated each of those links with either data sets where such existed or published literature, say within the area, so published literature from the Celtic Sea. If we haven't got that, we would use data or literature from adjacent comparable waters. And then basically, if you haven't got that, then is there any example around the world you could possibly pull up? And so the literature, that tool is being built as we speak. So that's the end of my presentation. I'll be happy to take questions later. Fishing is progressing well in Ireland. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. to touch upon so many elements and aspects, and also show us how the different elements of the project and knowledge and the model that we will produce can actually feed into this framework for an ecosystem assessment. I have several questions in all directions, so I've been thinking how to collect them in a kind of a coherent way. And I have questions more related to the general management of the projects, like, for example, the effects of pandemics, but also how can contribute to MPAs in Brazil. I'll address those one later. I think I'll start making some of the questions related to the more technical elements, and then we try to scale it up to the more general one. So for Saskia, for example, you have been talking about the trends of these indicators, and also identification of thresholds on these indicators. And you briefly mentioned that these indicators are basically selected often based on the ecosystem components that are present. Mm-hmm. One of the questions is, can this method of selection be more general? And is there a way to use information from process-based models, like Earth system models, in the definition of those indicators? Do you see this as a possible research pathway?
I mean, indicators, you can use anything that you like, that you think is representative of the system. For management, often indicators are based on survey data, and it's something that is measurable, that has been assembled also or monitored over the last few decades, ideally, and that is easy also to measure in the future. And so this is why often indicators have been used to assess the status of the system. Of course, you can also well, if you use model-based data, then it's also based on survey data that at some point also feed into the model itself. And then it has the bias of the model assumption and might be also not completely show the full picture. So it might be also any model output might be limiting as well. It depends a bit on what is there. If you have a system that is data rich, where you have a lot of survey data, then usually that is kind of the way forward to start with that. But sometimes you don't have that monitoring data, particularly not for a long time, like for 3 decades or so, which I said like is a requirement to really see something in the long run. And yeah, so you can also use model data. Also what is important, monitoring data is also limited in the sense of that it doesn't represent everything from the system. So if you want to know something about trophic flows, it can be better to use a food web model, like an ecopath model, and derive trophic flow indicators from that model to say something about the temporal development of that aspect of the system. So I think, yeah, a mix of both is good to get a picture of the full food web status, health status. But yeah, sometimes we have to use something that is available.
And to follow up on this, actually, I can use the occasion also to answer one of the questions we received from the question and answer table, which is the comment is from Christina Giat, and it's about integrated ecosystem assessment could be an amazing tool for policymakers in the ocean beyond national jurisdictions. But how essential are the MSFD descriptors to the process? And can or should the MSFD descriptors be applied more widely in areas where less is known? And I don't know if you want to answer, or Dave maybe wants to try to answer, since you touched upon MSFD indicators in your ODEM approach.
Yeah, that's probably my question to answer. No, it's in no way tied to MSFD descriptors. The basic the basic idea of our IEA is universal. You can use it anywhere. We linked it to MSFD because we're European based and that's our ecosystem legislation. However, it can be applied to any legislative framework. It could be applied to what's done in the US or Brazil or South Africa. So no, we're not, it doesn't require it at all. Whatever, all you need to do is do the policy, do the mapping of the things you're obliged to do. So for instance, the Magnuson-Stevens Act would suggest that you have to achieve MSY. So MSY would be a driver and that would fit into some of the fish stocks or some of the fish components in our model. So no, it doesn't need to do that. It is specifically intended to be for advice to policymakers. And one of the key things is that if you're advising policymakers, you don't have to do you can do the prioritization step I showed you, where you could explain well over half of the major risk in the marine environment. You then do the sort of semi-quantitative, or it is already semi-quantitative. You do the fully quantitative stuff that Saskia was talking about on those high priorities, and that would be where you'd advise policymakers. I suspect if you told them that every single component in the ocean is at risk, it would be a bit like a rabbit in the headlights. And so what we do is offer them prioritization on that. So if you deal with these few links and get them sorted, then you're going to get a lot of impact for your resources.
Thanks. And actually, this idea of scoring them based on importance links nicely to the research that Sergio has been conducting in a way, because these open ocean islands, they are very special places. I mean, where they are hotspot for biodiversity, but also special in terms of the human impact that in a way could be considered reduced a lot respect to other regions. You mentioned, Sergio, that in some of the analysis, you can see that islands that are more exposed to human pressures, they result with a reduced amount of biomass. And one of the questions is about how, or if you see any change also in the functional traits distribution.
What we can see is that, and I showed a little bit on that, is the lack of redundancy. In many places we have 2, 4, 5 species doing more or less the same, for instance, trophic level or same combination of traits. But in these very poor islands in terms of number of species, there's a lot of biomass, but very few species doing their functional thing there. So the combinations, there's sometimes just one species doing that combination of traits. So that's worrying, because anything that may happen to one of these species, that will be something that will impact a lot the ecosystem. That's the thing.
And many of these islands, they are already MPAs. I don't know if de facto or some of them actually from a legislation point of view. And one of the questions is actually, okay, the effects of these MPAs, but also the process of the research conducted in Mission Atlantic. How can it help in establishing maybe MPAs in Brazil, in the South Brazilian Shelf, where there has been a lot of discussion about increasing protection on the environment?
Yeah, good question. I was focusing today on this, on the islands, on the smaller islands that we have some kinds of protection already, but there still needs to be improved, for sure. Because sometimes we have a large NPA within the whole area, but we lack some protection in the very near shore of the island. So it's a paradox on that. We are protecting And sometimes we are protecting more water than what should be protected. But this is one thing. But the other part of the answer is that we have another case study that I didn't talk about today, that is in the South Brazilian shelf. And this one will deal with the marine protected areas on the along the Brazilian coast, especially on the southern and southeast coast. So this is a subject for another meeting that we will have more on that case.
And moving actually to the more the large scale, so we went into the small scale of these open ocean islands that with a lot of interesting elements of connectivity and similarities across those islands. A question for Roland is about your focus on these sampling the boundaries of these biogeographic regions, and you also touched upon the fact that we are using gliders in the project to sample some of those boundaries. Do you see it an advantage, the fact that, I mean, these gliders, they are not like research vessels that have more or less their mission planned at the start and they have to complete it within a period, while these gliders, they can be navigated into different regions based on the data that we will receive in near real time. So do you see it as an opportunity for sampling these boundaries in a way that has not been done before?
Yes, exactly. I mean, they're relatively cheap compared to vessel time. And like you say, you can actually monitor the data you're collecting in near real time. And because these boundaries are so dynamic and they're always in constant change, the glider mission can react to the ocean feature or boundary or system that you're looking at. I know in Mission Atlantic, we're only using one glider really as a demonstration to show that this works. But I can see in the future of using fleets of these gliders to tackle large scale systems and boundaries and having them out all the time collecting data continuously. With a vessel, you're constrained to the plan of a lot of different scientists that have different objectives. Whereas the glider, you can plan your specific mission and having data collected continuously using all different types of sensors. I focus on just acoustics, but there are, you can put any sensor on there as long as it's within the power budget of the glider itself. So yeah, I definitely see it as sort of a large advantage for the future of sort of surveying these dynamic features that can be ephemeral, short-lasting in time.
What type of feature do you expect to see in different regions from the acoustic sensing of the pelagic? Yeah,
I mean, another advantage is that the glider is very small. So unlike a large vessel, you don't really get a lot of avoidance issues near the surface. So you're also going to be sampling near surface fish populations, as well as the deeper communities, the sort of lanternfish that I mentioned earlier, and other mesopelagic fish. Around 900 species of fish are in that twilight zone. But yeah, you're going to get the surface communities as well, and you could also use wave gliders to go inshore in shallower regions where large research vessels couldn't go. So you've got the full spectrum of scale in terms of.
Yeah, but the question was more about what type of transition or what type of features you would see that will distinct between one biogeographic region to another.
Yeah, so I mean, for example, in the Southern Ocean, when you go to the subtropical fronts, you're going from nutrient poor water to nutrient rich water. And then at the boundary, you have complementary water mass mixing. So you get the iron from the warmer waters and the nutrients from the colder waters, and you expect an increase in production and biomass. So in a relatively short space, you can see enhancement in biomass abundance and changes in the vertical distribution of the community. So you expect to see sharp boundaries over very small distances when you hit those boundary lines, not just in the horizontal, but in the vertical as well.
So also in terms of the vertical behavior of these species.
Yeah.
I want to make a last question actually before to move into the more general questions about the projects and engaging with the project, because I forgot to make it before when Sergio mentioned about redundancy, and that's actually one of the attributes of resilience that we could consider in the integrated ecosystem assessment analysis. So the strength of these links or the vulnerability of those links will depend on the amount of redundancy or functional redundancy linking the specific pressure to the ecosystem component. So maybe I will ask Dave actually if this type of, you mentioned before the analysis of resilience in integrated ecosystem assessment, has it been done before in terms of the functional redundancy occurring in the specific ecosystem component?
No. Principally, it's been done with that longevity thing that I talked about. So you're basically saying that a more vulnerable sensitive species is basically one that lives for a long time and therefore has a slow cycle. So if you do damage to it, and that can be true of a habitat, or like a coral reef is a good example. If you do damage to it, the recovery time will be very long. So you treat that as a lack of resilience, which is not a bad way of approaching it. What I'm hoping for in Mission Atlantic is we can make that analysis more sophisticated, and Saskia showed how that might be done. You can look at trait redundancy, you can look at the presence or absence of tipping points. If something has a tipping point, that makes it much less resilient than where you can perhaps see a linear relationship. So no, I think that for me the approach we use, the resilience factors is the least sophisticated, and at the moment it's at that level. But by the end of it, when we take on the integrated ecosystem assessment for the entire Atlantic, Mission Atlantic does not lack ambition. Then when we do that, I'm hoping that we'll have the tools from people like Saskia and others to develop a slightly more sophisticated view of what resilience actually means. But resilience is a very slippery subject. It's quite difficult to pin down what you mean by resilience and what is real resilience and what is simply something like age.
Yeah. That actually links nicely to the some of these tools being available to a larger community, and that's a question that Joanna Soares is asking. So Mission Atlantic will produce a great amount of relevant data as well as resources. Will this be publicly available, and through which database and platform? So the majority of the data that we will produce, actually, we have a work package on the data management, and will be provided through EmonNet, although we are discussing with other partners other methods for distributing at least the metadata to other portals. And maybe I can ask Saskia to develop a little bit further on the way some of these statistical toolbox will be provided. And also maybe you can mention what type of workshops are ongoing in learning how to use these statistical tools.
Okay, so mainly we had recently one workshop on methods, but there was an internal workshop. But at some point we also will try to get a nice manual compiled together that is then publicly available, and kind of having an online tutorial that others can also use and apply. In terms of tools, we will work on R packages. R is currently the programming language that is amongst data scientists or like ecologists mostly used. So maybe in a few years it will be then in Python, but right now it's R. And so I started to make on a GitHub repository to have the IEA tools R package, but it's right now not publicly available. It still needs a few things like being changed, and so at some point hopefully then it's publicly available and people can try it out and feedback what's working, what maybe where there are certain bugs or not. But some of you might be not so familiar with R programming. If you're a manager and you just have your data set and you want to have it nicely already done, this is why we also want to have web applications based on Shiny that link to our servers. So the analysis is done in the background, and you can also then do the simple analysis quickly by yourself by having a user interface and just click a few things. Of course, I'm hardly advised to do this kind of approach with very complex models where you have to put a lot of thought into whether data should be transformed or not, or standardized in specific ways. Sometimes you have, for every individual step, you have to make a specific choice based on specific assumptions, and it's difficult then to automatize that process. But for the simpler analysis, this is something that we are aiming for, at least at the end of the project. We won't have it in 6 months' time, I think. And I think we also will use some of the data as demo data, so you can play around with. But I don't think that all the monitoring data and survey data that will be used in the case studies, that this will be all publicly available. It depends a bit. But yeah, we have this one work package, and Patrizio might know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, we have a policy of open data. So for the majority of the data that we will collect or produce in the project, they will be publicly available. Of course, these long-term time series that we don't own, I mean, we will provide references in terms of metadata from where the source of these data can actually be contacted and try to access those.
And my suggestion is also, hold on quick. So I guess as soon as there's something available, like an R package or a tutorial on something that is based on our internal workshops, we will have it also on our Mission Atlantic website. So I think probably it's best to every once in a while check our website and see what's the progress, if there's something that you can use or not.
Yep, exactly. And that's actually as you mentioned, the ambition, which is not lacking in Mission Atlantic, is also to have this web app where many of these statistical analysis could be maybe conducted live on a subset of the data. So there are questions about, let me go back. Yeah, we have something on collaboration, something on the effect of pandemics, and also something on capacity building. I'm not sure how to address which order, but maybe we can start with the effects of pandemics on the project. So, so far, the project has been able to adapt to the pandemics. Of course, we have been, we had an impact in terms of reduction, in terms of travels and communications within and with stakeholders in the project. In terms of the adapting to the conditions internally, it has been quite easy running some of these meetings online. In terms of replanning, some of the activity at sea has also been so far possible, although some unforeseen event, like for example, some specific sensors that had issues, and then the time to replace it, it's much longer because all these companies, they have now a long list of things that they have to fulfill before actually they can process all the requests. But one of the main impact we had was basically on stakeholder engagement. And maybe I need to ask Dave again to comment on that, because he's also the lead of Work Package 1 together with Meta. And you have the better overview about this impact in terms of stakeholder communications.
Yeah, so I mean, it's fairly self-evident that getting a group of people into a room has been quite difficult over the last few months, and you can replace that with online tools, but it's often very difficult to engage people. You know, people like us are in several Zoom, probably a dozen Zoom meetings a week. If you try and do that with people who are not used to that, it becomes much more difficult. So basically what we've done is sort of opted for the idea that we will get to be face-to-face with people in the next few months. Just for your information, I'm getting my COVID jab on Sunday, and I've just been told that, and it's my birthday today. So what more could you ask for? So we're sort of hoping in various situations that we can move ahead with this in the next few months, but it will be delayed a bit. And some of the situations in places like Brazil and South Africa are worse than they are in Ireland. So we're taking it slowly is the best answer. You can do it online, but it's much better to do it face to face.
Yes, indeed. And maybe I can merge two questions together because we have been asked how to engage with Mission Atlantic for those organizations that are interested to contribute, but they are not partnering in the project. And also we have been asked about if we have capacity building activities. So I think these two elements are actually quite connected. In fact, in Mission Atlantic, we have a very extensive number of activities in terms of capacity building, going from some of these events, also webinars and online tools for teaching. We have a mobility program, kind of for short-term mobility of a few weeks, mainly relevant for north to south type of collaborations, south to north collaborations, or east to west. So favoring the formation of this partnership around integrated ecosystem assessment. We also have a collaboration, and we didn't mention that, with the World Maritime University, to have some of the concepts that we are developing in the project available for projects or master projects through the World Maritime University. This will, the class of the World Maritime University is generally many from tropical regions and coastal regions that are interested maybe in ecosystem assessment. And we think that providing them material and ideas and data and maybe even financial support to carry on their projects is a way to expand the partnership of Mission Atlantic also to countries that are not directly involved. On top of that, you're always very welcome to contact Mission Atlantic through social media or through the website or by email. And we're always very innovative in terms of identifying opportunities of collaborations, and we are definitely very open to do that. Dave, you want to say something? Yeah, or you are saying that you're also open.
I was also going to say that if you feel you're a stakeholder in any one of the case study regions, would be very open to including you in our stakeholder database or stakeholder groups, because the classic problem with working with stakeholders is tracking them down and then persuading them to come to a meeting. It's something we always struggle with. So it'd be really great if you actually were interested enough to volunteer and join one of our stakeholder groups. And what we're doing with our stakeholder groups is specific. Most importantly, is showing them what we did, of course, but what we want to know from them is what are your objectives for an ecosystem evaluation? What do you want to know about the future that we could help you do? Now, we can't solve everything, but we can put those into our objectives, if you like, and relate them to what we can do with our particular analyses. And we could even modify, say, something like the ODEM to include a component that wasn't there before. So yeah, it'd be great to have you there. We're always open.
And the other platform where we could engage is through this All Atlantic Research Initiative, we're at the moment is organizing every year or even more frequently meetings with the All Atlantic Partnership, going from pole to pole. So it's even expanding, not only the one that have been signing the Belém agreement or the Galway agreement, but actually is expanding to other nations like Argentina. I know Morocco is also engaged, and there are more to come. So this All Atlantic Forum is actually quite open, and in Mission Atlantic we plan to engage and also recruit, I don't know if it's the right word, but engage with stakeholders through this Atlantic Forum. If you go to the website, again, there is also a section dedicated to the end user groups. So with some specific end users, so end user are those that actually can use some of the products in Mission Atlantic to solve their daily problem in working with the ecosystem or marine ecosystem. For a subgroup of them, we actually plan to engage continuously to identify how to shape the products that we have, or the potential solutions that we have, into specific products that they can use in their work. So we have a lot of different channels for engagement, from advice and sharing ideas to opportunities for collaborations to actually benefit of the solutions that we will produce. I think I addressed almost all of them. We are also running out of time, but I want to close with the last one that we have in the question and answer panel from Yaya Soro, and maybe ask Dave again, because first he's a fishery scientist, second because you mentioned seaspiracy, and the question is about could the development of coastal marine fish farming contribute to the reduction of fishing pressure on natural resources? And this is one of the topics that I think seaspiracy touched upon, so maybe you are more entitled to mention that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question, and I guess in some ways seaspiracy also answered that question. Yes, in theory it's possible, but of course aquaculture or mariculture brings its own stressors for the marine environment, and I think if you're looking at the link between whether you should stop doing fisheries with all its impacts and concentrate on aquaculture, well, yeah, okay, but one of the problems is most fish aquaculture actually feeds fish to the fish. So you collect what we call forage fish, the sort of small pelagics or sand eels or whatever, and then we feed them to fish. Now, there are some initiatives mentioned in the program about non-fish based fish food, but the success rate with that has been pretty low to date. Now, nothing's impossible in our current world, but the likelihood is that for the time being, aquaculture will still be dependent on wild capture fishing. So I think what you've got to look at it's much more important to work out what your objectives actually are, and then decide the balance of risk and threats from each of those activities. It's important to understand that exploiting an ecosystem will always have impact on it, just always have impact. It's a question of whether those impacts are sustainable in whatever dimension you care to think about it, ecologically, economically, socially. And you then have to trade off. You have to decide what things are most important to you. And I think that's the problem with something like seaspiracy, is that it doesn't make that balance. It doesn't say, getting protein is important. It simply says, let's stop damaging the marine environment. And that's great, but what that means is if we're not going to fish anymore, then we're going to have to impact something else. That means we move it onto land, or in many cases, we move our activities into the third world, which I would not propose at all. Move our biodiversity impacts to the third world, not very good thing to do. So I'm being a bit controversial there, but that's my, I'm 64, so I'm retiring soon.
But it's also there in the main message is that not to take these pressures in isolation, but to have them in context of each other and make decisions based on the different trade-offs, as you mentioned.
That was exactly the point of the analysis we did. You have to view it in a holistic sense. You can't view it in little bits in isolation. Yes.
And with this one, I think we will wrap up the day. And thanks everyone for attending and for staying with us until now. Thanks to all the speakers for great presentations, and I can foresee a lot of fun in running Mission Atlantic for the next 4+ years. So we will have a lot of opportunities of engagement and interactions, and we hope to actually open it up to a larger community across the Atlantic and also beyond. And with that said, have a nice weekend.
Yeah.
Thank you, and thanks for listening.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
And thanks the Air Center to support us. Yeah. Bye.
And feel free to contact us if you have more questions.